Imagine walking through corridors so thick with concrete that your voice dies before it reaches the next person. Imagine breathing air that tastes of industrial cleaning chemicals and human desperation. Imagine a place where the architecture itself has been weaponized against the people trapped inside. In November 1991, the Federal Bureau of Prisons opened a facility in Northeast Philadelphia that cost $68 million to build. That's $160 million in today's money. They called it a model of efficiency, a triumph of modern correctional design. But within 18 months, it had become something else entirely. A machine that consumed human dignity at an industrial scale. The politicians promised rehabilitation. The architects delivered a concrete tomb. The engineers calculated maximum capacity, but forgot to account for the weight of human misery. And when the machine finally broke down, it didn't collapse in a single catastrophic moment. It failed slowly, in the dark, one broken soul at a time. Today, we're opening the classified files on America's most expensive experiment in human containment. We're going inside the walls to examine the blueprints, count the real costs, and uncover the truth about what happens when a society decides that concrete can solve problems that have defeated every civilization in human history. This is the story of how good intentions hardened into something monstrous, how the most sophisticated prison technology ever deployed was defeated by bedsheets and determination, how a building designed to process people like inventory ended up processing the humanity right out of them. If you're ready to examine the intersection of architecture and cruelty, of bureaucracy and broken lives, then stay with us, because this story doesn't end when the last inmate walks free. It ends when we finally understand that the machine is still running, still consuming souls, still convinced that human chaos can be solved with concrete and steel. The files are open. The truth is waiting. And once you see how the machine really works, you'll never look at justice the same way again. The shape emerges from the fog at dawn, hulking against the Philadelphia skyline like a question mark carved in concrete. From the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge you can see it if you know where to look, a sprawling fortress of gray walls and razor wire squatting in the industrial wasteland of Northeast Philadelphia. But most people don't look. Most people drive past without knowing it's there. This is the story of how a city convinced itself that concrete could solve human chaos. How architects drew blueprints for order and engineers poured foundations for control. How $68 million in 1989 money, $160 million in today's currency, bought a machine designed to warehouse the unwanted and forgotten. But machines break down. And when they do, the people inside become the spare parts. The Federal Detention Center at Philadelphia sits on 42 acres of land that nobody wanted. Industrial soil, contaminated by decades of chemical runoff from the nearby Frankfurt Arsenal. The city sold it cheap in 1987, eager to convert a liability into revenue. The Federal Bureau of Prisons needed space, fast. Overcrowding lawsuits were mounting, and the old facilities downtown were crumbling under the weight of the crack epidemic and mandatory minimums. The architect's plans called for efficiency. Reinforced concrete walls, 8 to 10 inches thick. Prefabricated cell modules that could be installed like building blocks. Guard towers positioned not for optimal sight lines, but for visual impact. Psychological deterrence through architectural intimidation. The design followed federal guidelines down to the last rivet. Everything calculated for maximum capacity at minimum cost. But there were compromises. There are always compromises. The soil studies, filed with the Army Corps of Engineers in March of 1988, flagged drainage issues in the lower levels, clay substrate, water table fluctuations during heavy rain. The engineers recommended additional waterproofing and French drains around the foundation. Estimated cost, $800,000. The recommendation was noted, filed, and quietly shelved. Phase 2 improvements, they called it. Phase 2 never came. By summer, the concrete trucks were already rolling. The construction timeline stretched across 3 years of Philadelphia's bloodiest decade. While crews poured foundations in the shadow of the Betsy Ross Bridge, the city's murder rate climbed past 400 annually. The newspapers ran daily tallies like sports scores. The politicians promised solutions, and the Bureau of Prisons delivered blueprints. The walls rose methodically, concrete block by concrete block, rebar grid by rebar grid. The contractor, Hensel Phelps Construction, worked in phases: housing units first, then administrative wings, finally the perimeter security. Each housing unit contained 128 cells, arranged in a modified cruciform pattern that allowed a single guard in the central station to observe 4 corridors simultaneously. Efficiency through geometry. But the acoustics were an afterthought. Those 8-inch concrete walls, so effective at containing bodies, created a sound chamber that amplified every voice, every footstep, every metal door slamming shut. The noise bounced endlessly off hard surfaces, creating a constant low-frequency rumble that would drive guards to early retirement and inmates to the edge of madness. The architects knew about sound transmission. The physics were basic. Concrete reflects, absorbs nothing. But sound-dampening materials cost money, and the budget was already bleeding red. The Bureau's standard specifications called for adequate noise control, which meant whatever was cheapest. They installed it and moved on. The political machinery that birthed this place operated in the shadow of Election Day 1988. Mayor Wilson Goode was fighting for his political life after the MOVE bombing 3 years earlier. City Council was hemorrhaging credibility as corruption scandals made headlines weekly. Federal intervention wasn't just convenient, it was necessary. Let Washington handle the problems Philadelphia couldn't solve. The budget hearings for the new detention center took place in a half-empty committee room on a Tuesday morning in October. 17 minutes of testimony. No public comment period. The federal government would pay for construction and operations. The city would provide land and basic utilities. Everyone signed the papers and went home, but buried in the fine print was a clause that would haunt the facility for decades. To offset construction overruns, the Bureau quietly reduced staffing ratios from the recommended 1 guard per 16 inmates to 1 guard per 24 inmates. A small number on paper, a lifetime of consequences in practice. The math was seductive in its simplicity: 2,400 inmates at full capacity. 102 guards per shift. $42 million annually in operating costs, compared to $68 million for traditional maximum security housing. The savings looked magnificent on spreadsheets presented to Congress. Reality would prove more expensive. The final construction costs exceeded initial estimates by $18 million. Cost overruns in structural steel as specifications changed mid-build, upgraded security hardware as technology evolved, and change orders as inspectors discovered shortcuts in the foundation work. The drainage issues flagged in the soil studies manifested as flooded service tunnels during the first major rainstorm. Emergency pumping systems were installed at a cost of $400,000. By opening day, the facility was already operating in deficit, not financially, but operationally. Systems that looked elegant on paper proved clumsy in practice. Electronic locking mechanisms that required manual override codes that supervisors carried on laminated cards. Air handling systems that created dead zones where radio signals couldn't penetrate. Security cameras with blind spots in stairwells and service corridors where violence would later flourish. The first inmates arrived on a Tuesday morning in November 1991, transported in white federal buses with tinted windows. No media coverage, no ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just a quiet transfer of human cargo from the aging facilities downtown to the gleaming new machine in the wasteland. The intake process was clinical. Each new arrival received a plastic identification band, a property inventory, and a cell assignment generated by computer algorithm. No consideration for personality conflicts, mental health needs, or gang affiliations. The computer cared only about bed space and security classification. It sorted human beings like packages in a warehouse. The guards, many recruited from other federal facilities, walked corridors that still smelled of fresh paint and industrial cleaning chemicals. They carried keys to doors that sometimes jammed in their locks. They monitored inmates through security cameras that occasionally went dark. They followed protocols written for facilities that existed only in regulation manuals. On the third day of operations, a software glitch in the master control system froze all electronic locks in Housing Unit C for 17 minutes. Guards couldn't open cells for scheduled movement. Inmates couldn't be released for meals. The manual override required a supervisor with proper codes, but the shift supervisor was in a meeting in the administrative wing, unreachable by radio in the concrete-shielded corridors. 17 minutes. Not long enough for panic, but long enough for everyone to understand how fragile the whole system really was. How dependent on technology that nobody fully understood. How quickly control could slip away. The guards wrote incident reports. The warden noted the need for protocol revisions. The computer logs were archived, and the next day the machine kept running, carrying the memory of its first small failure, like a crack in a foundation that would slowly widen with time. But in those early days, before the cracks became visible, before the machine began to eat itself, there was a kind of terrible beauty in its operation. The precision of the counts, the choreography of controlled movement, the illusion that human chaos could be contained by concrete and steel and electronic surveillance. The architects had drawn their blueprints, the engineers had poured their foundations, the politicians had signed their contracts. All that remained was to test whether their machine could hold the weight of human misery without collapsing under its own contradictions. The test would last 3 decades, and in the end, the machine would fail, not because it was poorly built, but because it was built too well. A perfect system for controlling bodies that never learned how to handle souls. Time becomes the first weapon in the machine's arsenal. 5:45 in the morning, every morning, the count begins. Steel doors sliding open with hydraulic precision. Guards moving through corridors in prescribed patterns, checking each cell, marking each clipboard. The rhythm is absolute, mechanical, unforgiving. No variation. No exception, no acknowledgement that the sun might rise differently on any given day. In the federal detention center's early months, the schedule worked like clockwork. Inmates rose at count time, moved to the showers in groups of 12, proceeded to the cafeteria in alphabetical order by housing unit. The computer had calculated optimal flow patterns through the facility's narrow corridors. 2,400 inmates, reduced to variables in a mathematical equation. But mathematics doesn't account for the weight of human misery. The corridors were designed for efficiency, not comfort. 6 feet wide, lined with the same 8-inch concrete walls that muffled sound in the cells. When 300 inmates needed to move from one housing unit to another for meals or programs, they formed lines that stretched the length of football fields. A single bottleneck, a jammed door, a medical emergency, a guard running behind schedule, could back up movement for hours, and in those hours, pressure built. Invisible at first, like stress fractures in a dam. Inmates standing shoulder to shoulder in concrete tunnels, breathing recycled air that carried the weight of too many bodies in too small a space. Guards counting and recounting, radio chatter crackling with updates and delays, the machine trying to process human beings at a rate that human beings weren't designed to sustain. Time became a weapon because time was all anyone had. Sentences measured not in days or months, but in decades. Life without parole. Multiple life sentences. Numbers so large they lost meaning, became abstractions that the mind couldn't grasp. 25 years, 40 years, 85 years. What does a man do with 85 years of concrete and steel? He counts smaller increments. Minutes until the next meal, hours until lockdown, days until visiting hours, weeks until commissary, months until his appeal hearing, years until his first parole review. Time fractures into fragments small enough to survive. But the machine kept bigger time. The schedule that never varied, never acknowledged birthdays or holidays, or the particular grief of a man who received word that his mother had died, and his funeral was yesterday, and he would never again hear her voice, except in the echo chamber of his memory. The cafeteria operated on 17-minute meal periods. Inmates filed in, collected pre-portioned trays from the serving line, consumed their meals at stainless steel tables bolted to the floor, and filed out. No conversation permitted. No lingering. No human recognition of the basic social ritual that had defined civilization since the first humans learned to share food around a fire. 17 minutes, calculated by food service consultants to maximize throughput while maintaining adequate nutrition delivery. The bureaucratic language reduced eating to a mechanical process, like refueling vehicles at a service station. The guards learned to move like machines themselves. 3 years into the facility's operation, turnover rates approached 60% annually. The concrete walls that contained inmates also contained the guards, 8 hours at a stretch, breathing the same recycled air, hearing the same endless noise, walking the same predetermined patterns through corridors that led nowhere except back to where they started. Radio protocols developed to manage communication in the concrete deadened environment. Guards spoke in codes that reduced human emergencies to numbers and letters. Code blue for medical emergency. Code red for violence. Code yellow for equipment malfunction. Human suffering became data points transmitted through scratchy radio signals that barely penetrated the facility's thick walls. The master control room sat at the heart of the complex like the brain of a vast organism. Banks of monitors displayed every corridor, every cell block, every entrance and exit. Guards watched screens that showed guards watching other screens in an endless, recursive loop of surveillance. The watchers watching the watchers watching the watched. But the cameras couldn't see everything. They captured movement, but not motivation. They recorded actions, but not intentions. The angles were calculated for maximum coverage, but coverage isn't the same as comprehension. In the blind spots between camera positions, in the seconds between radio checks, in the space between what was documented and what actually happened, the human reality of the prison operated according to laws that no architect had written into the blueprints. The electronic locking system represented the pinnacle of correctional technology circa 1991. Magnetic locks controlled by computer, operated from central command stations, backed up by manual overrides in case of power failure. The sales literature promised instantaneous response capability and fail-safe redundancy systems. But redundancy was only as strong as the weakest link, and the weakest link was always human. Guards carried override codes on plastic cards that they sometimes forgot, sometimes lost, sometimes left in vehicles parked outside the facility. The computer system required software updates that sometimes installed incorrectly, sometimes corrupted existing data, sometimes created new problems while solving old ones. 3 months after opening, during a routine software upgrade, the master control system lost communication with Housing Unit D for 47 minutes. Guards couldn't unlock cells for the evening meal service. Inmates couldn't be moved to the medical unit for scheduled appointments. The backup systems functioned exactly as designed, by defaulting to lockdown mode until normal operations could be restored. 47 minutes, not long enough to qualify as an emergency, just long enough for everyone to understand that the machine could stop working at any moment, for any reason, without warning. The incident report cited minor software incompatibility issues and recommended enhanced system testing protocols for future upgrades. But the real revelation was simpler and more disturbing. The inmates had been quieter during the lockdown than during normal operations, calmer, almost peaceful, as if the machine worked better when it wasn't running at all. The noise never stopped. This became the most unexpected torture of the new facility. Not violence, not darkness, not isolation, but the constant, grinding, inescapable noise of 2,400 human beings contained in concrete chambers that amplified every sound. The architects had calculated sightlines and security zones and cost per bed. They had not calculated the cumulative acoustic impact of steel doors slamming shut 800 times per day, of footsteps echoing through corridors 24 hours continuously, of human voices trying to communicate across spaces designed to prevent communication. The concrete walls that provided security also created perfect sound reflection. Every word bounced endlessly between hard surfaces, creating a low-frequency rumble that penetrated cell walls and human skulls with equal efficiency. Sleep became impossible not because of lights, Those could be covered, but because of sound that no barrier could stop. Guards began reporting hearing loss within the first year of operation. Not dramatic, acute damage, but the slow, accumulating degradation that comes from chronic exposure to industrial-level noise. They requested hearing protection, were issued foam earplugs that made radio communication impossible, abandoned the protection, and accepted the damage. The medical unit documented a pattern of symptoms that had no precedent in correctional literature: chronic headaches, sleep disruption, hypervigilance, auditory hallucinations. Inmates reported hearing voices in the constant background noise, conversations that weren't happening, threats that existed only in the acoustic chaos bouncing between concrete walls. The machine was literally driving people insane with sound. But the most damaging noise wasn't mechanical. It was human. The constant, desperate, futile attempt at communication across space designed to prevent it. Men shouting to friends they couldn't see in cells they couldn't reach through walls that would never yield. Conversations conducted at volume levels that ensured everyone heard everything. Privacy sacrificed to the basic human need for connection. The silence would have been more merciful. But silence was impossible in a concrete echo chamber filled with souls trying to prove they still existed by making sound that someone, somewhere, might hear and recognize as human. Night brought no relief. The shifts changed, but the noise continued. Different guards, same footsteps. Different inmates, same desperation. The facility operated 24 hours because human misery doesn't observe business hours. The machine ran constantly, efficiently, remorselessly, transforming the simple human need for rest into another form of punishment. And somewhere in the administrative wing, the warden's sleep was undisturbed by the industrial symphony he had helped create. His office windows faced away from the housing units, toward the street, toward the normal world where people still believed that concrete and steel could solve problems that had defeated every civilization in human history. The warden slept. The machine did not. And in the spaces between sleep and wakefulness, in the gray zones where exhaustion meets desperation, the first cracks began to appear in the foundation of the experiment. Small cracks at first. Hairline fractures in the institutional logic. But cracks have a way of growing, especially under pressure. And pressure was the one thing the machine produced in unlimited quantities. The maintenance crew arrived at 6 in the morning, every morning, carrying toolboxes filled with temporary solutions to permanent problems. By the facility's second year of operation, the work orders were piling up faster than they could be completed. Door locks that seized without warning, drainage pipes that backed up during heavy rain, light fixtures that flickered and died in corridors where darkness was a luxury no one could afford. The infrastructure was failing not because it was poorly built, but because it was being used beyond its design specifications. The architects had calculated stress loads and structural tolerances based on normal commercial construction standards. They had not calculated the unique wear patterns created by desperate human beings, testing every surface, every joint, every potential weakness in their concrete universe. Cell doors designed for light residential use were being opened and closed 50 times per day instead of 5. Plumbing systems rated for office buildings were processing the waste of men whose diets consisted entirely of institutional food that their bodies couldn't properly digest. Electrical systems planned for standard illumination were powering security equipment that ran continuously, generating heat that the ventilation system couldn't adequately manage. The work orders told the story in bureaucratic language that couldn't disguise the underlying chaos. Cell 247A. Door mechanism requires excessive force to engage lock. Housing Unit C. Intermittent power fluctuations affecting electronic systems. Service Corridor 7. Standing water following precipitation events. Each report was a symptom of the same disease. The building was breaking down under the weight of human desperation. Tommy Morrison had been a maintenance supervisor for 12 years before taking the job at the Federal Detention Center. He'd worked construction, managed apartment complexes, kept shopping malls running. But he'd never encountered anything like the systematic destruction that occurred when human beings had nothing to do except test the limits of their confinement. The inmates weren't vandalizing the facility exactly, they were exploring it. Every surface became a potential tool, every flaw a possible opportunity, every weakness a source of hope that maybe, somehow, the concrete wasn't as permanent as it appeared. They learned the building better than the people who designed it, mapping its vulnerabilities with the focused attention of men who had nothing but time. A loose tile in the shower could be worked free over months of careful manipulation. A crack in the concrete near a window frame could be enlarged with patient scraping using improvised tools fashioned from commissary items. A door that didn't quite seat properly in its frame could be tested, studied, gradually coaxed into revealing the tolerance that might, eventually, become an escape route. The guards knew what was happening but couldn't stop it. Searching every cell every day was impossible with existing staffing levels. Confiscating every potential tool would mean removing anything that wasn't permanently affixed to the walls. Soap dishes, toilet paper holders, even the thin mattresses that provided the only barrier between human flesh and concrete sleeping surfaces. So the destruction continued, slow and methodical and utterly relentless. Not the explosive violence of riot, but the patient erosion of limestone cliffs worn down by ocean waves. Each day brought new damage too small to justify emergency repairs, too widespread to address comprehensively, too expensive to ignore indefinitely. The facility's annual maintenance budget had been calculated based on standard commercial building depreciation rates, 3% of construction costs annually, adjusted for inflation. But by the third year of operation, maintenance expenses were exceeding 6% annually, and the problems were accelerating rather than stabilizing. The concrete itself was aging poorly. The quick-setting mixtures used during construction to meet aggressive deadlines contained additives that increased workability but reduced long-term durability. Surface spalling appeared first around the exercise yards, where temperature fluctuations caused expansion and contraction cycles that the concrete couldn't accommodate. The spalling spread to corridor walls, then to cell interiors, creating rough surfaces that caught clothing, cut skin, and provided handholds for climbing. The electrical systems were showing signs of premature failure throughout the complex. Moisture infiltration through the foundation, the drainage issues identified but never addressed during construction, was corroding junction boxes and cable runs in the service tunnels. Emergency generators failed load tests with increasing frequency. Backup lighting systems designed to operate for 4 hours during power outages were lasting barely 2 hours before battery depletion. But the most serious infrastructure failure was human. The guards, the maintenance staff, the administrative personnel who kept the machine running were burning out at rates that threatened the facility's basic operational capacity. Sick leave usage exceeded projections by 40% in the facility's second year. Workers' compensation claims for stress-related injuries increased by 60%. Turnover in critical positions, electronics technicians, plumbing specialists, HVAC contractors, meant that institutional knowledge walked out the door every few months, taking with it the informal understanding of which systems were reliable and which required constant attention. New employees learned the building's quirks through trial and error, making mistakes that experienced staff would have avoided, creating problems that compounded existing vulnerabilities. The facility was losing its memory of itself, becoming an increasingly complex organism that nobody fully understood. The work orders accumulated in filing cabinets that grew heavier each month. Repair damaged concrete in Cell Block D. Replace corroded electrical conduit in Service Tunnel 3. Address persistent moisture issues in Administrative Wing Basement. Each request represented hours of labor by skilled technicians working at premium overtime rates because normal business hours couldn't accommodate the facility's operational schedule. The machine needed constant care to keep running, but the care was provided by humans who were being ground down by the same forces that were wearing out the building's infrastructure. The facility was consuming itself, metabolizing its own substance to maintain the illusion of control and order. In the warden's monthly reports to the Bureau of Prisons headquarters, the maintenance issues were summarized in optimistic language that emphasized solutions rather than problems. Ongoing infrastructure improvements continue to enhance facility security and operational efficiency. The numbers told a different story, but the numbers were buried in appendices that headquarters staff rarely read. The gap between official narrative and operational reality was widening like the cracks in the foundation. And like those cracks, the gap was invisible from the outside, apparent only to those who lived and worked in the space between what the machine was supposed to do and what it actually did. The psychological architecture of the facility was failing even more dramatically than its physical infrastructure. The original design assumed that isolation would promote reflection, that boredom would encourage compliance, that the simple removal of freedoms would naturally result in rehabilitation. But isolation bred paranoia, boredom fermented into rage, and the removal of freedoms created a vacuum that was filled by the darkest impulses of human nature. Mental health services at the facility consisted of a single psychologist who worked 3 days per week and maintained a caseload of over 400 inmates. Individual counseling sessions lasted 15 minutes and occurred monthly for inmates who specifically requested them. Group therapy was conducted in the same multi-purpose rooms used for legal meetings, with no soundproofing and no privacy from guards or other inmates. The psychology department's records documented a pattern of deterioration that the system wasn't designed to address. Chronic depression affected an estimated 70% of the population within 6 months of arrival. Anxiety disorders spiked to rates 4 times higher than comparable civilian populations. Suicide attempts occurred weekly, often using methods that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the facility's surveillance blind spots. But the most disturbing trend was the emergence of institutionalized thinking patterns that rendered inmates increasingly incapable of functioning outside the prison's rigid structure. Men who had lived independently for decades began requiring permission to use the bathroom, to change clothes, to make any decision more complex than which meal tray to select from an identical array of options. The facility was succeeding too well at its unstated mission, breaking human beings down to manageable components. But broken people don't rehabilitate. They just become more broken until eventually they break entirely in ways that can't be hidden behind euphemistic incident reports. The first serious violence occurred on a Tuesday afternoon during shift change, when guard coverage was at its minimum and inmate movement was at its maximum. A dispute over commissary purchases escalated into a stabbing in the corridor between housing units B and C. The weapon was a sharpened plastic spoon that had been gradually honed against concrete surfaces until it was capable of penetrating human flesh. The response time was 17 minutes, not because the guards were slow, but because the facility's communication systems created deadly delays in emergency situations. The guard who witnessed the attack couldn't reach his radio while attempting to provide first aid. The guard who received the distress call couldn't immediately locate the incident because the facility's corridor numbering system was confusing even to staff who worked there daily. The medical team couldn't reach the scene because the elevator was in use and the stairwells were locked during normal inmate movement periods. 17 minutes, long enough for one human being to nearly bleed to death while surrounded by people whose job was to keep him safe. The incident report blamed communication protocol failures and recommended enhanced emergency response training. But the real problem was architectural. The building itself was an obstacle to the safety of everyone inside it. The violence spread not through coordination but through contagion. Inmates who had never been violent discovered that aggression was the only currency that commanded respect in an environment where respect was the difference between survival and victimization. Guards who had joined the profession to maintain order found themselves managing chaos with tools that were inadequate for the task. The weapons came from nowhere and everywhere. Toilet paper rolls soaked in water and allowed to dry became clubs hard as wood. Metal strips peeled from damaged ceiling tiles became knives. Even food became dangerous when inmates learned to ferment fruit into alcohol that could blind guards during surprise attacks. The searches increased in frequency and intensity, but every search revealed new innovations in improvised weaponry that demonstrated the infinite creativity of desperate minds. The facility was locked down for extended periods while staff attempted to locate and confiscate dangerous items But the lockdowns only increased tensions by removing the few privileges that made confinement bearable. The cycle was vicious and accelerating. Violence bred security measures that increased desperation, that bred more violence that required more security measures. The machine was eating itself, consuming its own capacity for control in an endless spiral of action and reaction that had no natural endpoint. The medical unit began documenting injuries that didn't fit standard categories of institutional violence. Self-inflicted wounds that were too systematic to be suicide attempts, but too severe to be attention-seeking behavior. Injuries that suggested inmates were testing their own pain tolerance, as if preparing for worse suffering to come. The psychological evaluations revealed a pattern that had no precedent in correctional literature. Learned helplessness so profound that inmates were losing basic survival instincts. Men who had successfully navigated dangerous streets for decades were becoming incapable of protecting themselves in an environment that should have been safer than the communities they came from. The facility was transforming predators into prey, victims into victimizers, human beings into something else entirely. Something that fit the institutional categories but had lost the essential qualities that made rehabilitation possible. The machine was working exactly as designed, and the result was more terrifying than failure would have been, because the machine was succeeding at a mission that nobody had officially acknowledged: the systematic destruction of human dignity in service of bureaucratic efficiency. The inmates were being processed, contained, and managed with mathematical precision, but they weren't being prepared for anything except more processing, more containment, more management. The recidivism rate for inmates released from the facility exceeded 90% within 3 years of release, not because the machine had failed to teach them anything, but because it had taught them exactly the wrong things: how to survive in a world without privacy, without autonomy, without hope. How to function in an environment where human worth was measured by compliance with arbitrary rules enforced by indifferent authority. How to live as something less than human. And once that lesson was learned, it was very difficult to unlearn. The riots came not with fire and fury, but with something worse: methodical precision. It was a Thursday in November, 18 months after opening, when the temperature dropped below freezing, and the heating system failed in Housing Unit C. The maintenance request had been filed 2 weeks earlier. The repair was scheduled for the following Monday. But the human beings trapped in those concrete cells couldn't wait for bureaucratic schedules. The uprising began at 4:30 in the morning during the routine count. Guard Patricia Martinez entered the unit and found every cell door propped open with torn bed sheets. 56 inmates stood in their doorways, not moving, not speaking, just watching her with the patient attention of predators who had learned to hunt in packs. The electronic locks still functioned. The doors could still be secured from the control room. But the inmates had discovered something that the architects never anticipated. The magnetic locking system couldn't overcome the resistance of fabric wedged in the door frames, a fundamental flaw in the most sophisticated security technology available, defeated by cotton bed sheets torn into strips by desperate hands. Martinez reached for her radio and found the corridor flooded with electronic interference. Later investigation revealed that inmates had been hoarding battery-powered radios from the commissary, tuning them to frequencies that created white noise across the guard communication channels. The riot had been planned with the precision of a military operation, using the facility's own systems against itself. The response protocol called for immediate lockdown and deployment of the tactical team. But the tactical team was understaffed because 2 members had called in sick and 1 was attending his daughter's wedding. The lockdown couldn't be implemented because the master control system was experiencing one of its periodic software glitches, and the backup manual controls were located in a service tunnel that had been flooded for 3 days due to the ongoing drainage problems. For 47 minutes, 56 inmates controlled an entire housing unit in a maximum security federal facility. They didn't rape or murder or burn. They sat quietly in the common area and waited for someone in authority to acknowledge their existence as human beings capable of suffering from cold. When the heating system was repaired 2 hours later, the inmates returned to their cells and allowed the doors to be secured. No charges were filed, No punitive measures taken. The incident report classified the event as a work stoppage rather than a riot, minimizing its significance in the official record while maximizing its impact on everyone who understood what had actually happened. The machine could be stopped, not by violence or chaos, but by the simple refusal of human beings to cooperate with their own dehumanization. The most sophisticated security technology ever deployed in an American correctional facility had been neutralized by bedsheets and determination. The lesson spread through the facility like wildfire. Not the specific tactics, those were quickly countered by new regulations and modified equipment, but the fundamental realization that compliance was a choice, and choices could be reconsidered. The first escape attempt came 6 weeks later, during a blizzard that grounded the helicopters and made ground pursuit nearly impossible. 3 inmates from different housing units somehow coordinated their movements to reach the service tunnels during the shift change when guard coverage was minimal and electronic surveillance was compromised by the same moisture problems that had been flagged but never addressed during construction. They made it 800 yards through the drainage system before hypothermia forced them to surface near the perimeter fence. Local police found them unconscious in a snowbank, more dead than alive, but technically outside the facility's secure perimeter for 37 minutes before recapture. The escape itself was less significant than what it revealed about the building's vulnerabilities. The service tunnels, designed for maintenance access, provided unmonitored corridors that connected every major section of the facility. The drainage system that had never been properly waterproofed was accessible through utility panels that could be opened with tools improvised from commissary items. The perimeter fence, designed to stop vehicles in large groups, was ineffective against individuals willing to risk death in sub-zero temperatures. Most damaging of all was the discovery that the escape had been planned using blueprints obtained from a guard who had been seduced by an inmate's girlfriend during visiting hours. The security of the entire facility had been compromised not by sophisticated intelligence gathering, but by the basic human need for connection, exploiting the basic human weakness for affection. The investigation lasted 4 months and resulted in policy changes that made the facility more secure but less functional. Visiting hours were reduced. Communication monitoring was increased. Guard rotation schedules were modified to prevent the development of personal relationships with inmates. The machine became more machine-like, but at the cost of the human elements that had kept it running smoothly. The unintended consequence was that the guards began to exhibit the same psychological symptoms as the inmates: isolation, paranoia, learned helplessness, and gradually increasing aggression toward anyone who represented authority or control. The facility was creating 2 populations of damaged people, those who were locked in cells and those who carried keys. The violence that followed was different from traditional prison riots. It wasn't explosive or theatrical. It was quiet, systematic, and utterly ruthless. Inmates who had learned to hate the system began targeting anyone who represented that system, while guards who had learned to fear the inmates began using force preemptively rather than reactively. The medical unit's records told the story in clinical language that couldn't disguise the underlying brutality. Multiple contusions consistent with blunt force trauma. Lacerations requiring sutures. Concussion with temporary loss of consciousness. Notites, each report was another data point in a pattern that proved the facility was failing at its most basic mission: keeping people safe. The psychological evaluations revealed something even more disturbing than physical violence. Both inmates and guards were developing similar coping mechanisms: emotional numbing, hypervigilance, and a worldview that divided humanity into predators and prey, with no middle ground for normal human interaction. The facility was creating monsters on both sides of the bars, not because the people were inherently monstrous, but because the environment systematically stripped away every human quality except the capacity for survival in an inhuman setting. The breaking point came during the spring flood of 1994, when 3 days of heavy rain overwhelmed the facility's inadequate drainage systems and flooded the service levels. Emergency power failed, electronic locks defaulted to secure mode, trapping inmates in cells without light, heat, or functioning toilets. The backup manual systems couldn't be accessed because the service tunnels were underwater. For 16 hours, 1,200 human beings were locked in concrete boxes while raw sewage backed up through the plumbing system and the temperature dropped to dangerous levels. Guards couldn't reach inmates who were having medical emergencies. Inmates couldn't signal guards when cellmates were suffering seizures or heart attacks. The facility became a collection of individual tombs connected by flooded corridors that no one could navigate. When power was finally restored and the water pumped out, the damage assessment required 3 weeks to complete. The financial cost exceeded $8 million. New electrical systems, replacement equipment, hazmat cleanup, and structural repairs. But the human cost couldn't be calculated in dollar amounts. 7 inmates required hospitalization for hypothermia. Dozens more suffered from dehydration, exposure, and psychological trauma that would manifest in behavioral problems for months to come. 3 guards resigned immediately and never returned to correctional work. The facility's operational capacity was reduced by 30% while repairs were completed. The incident report blamed unprecedented weather conditions and infrastructure limitations inherited from the design phase. But the real cause was simpler and more damning. The facility had been built to contain human beings without regard for their survival in emergency situations. The machine prioritized security over safety, control over humanity, efficiency over basic human dignity. And when the machine broke down, people died. Not from violence or negligence, but from the logical operation of a system that treated human beings as inventory to be stored rather than souls to be preserved. The facility reopened 3 months later with enhanced emergency protocols, improved drainage systems, and upgraded backup power capacity. The physical problems had been solved with engineering solutions that cost millions of dollars and took months to implement. But the human problems remained unsolved and unsolvable. Because the human problems weren't bugs in the system, they were features. The facility was working exactly as designed, producing exactly the results that the blueprints had intended. Broken people who could be efficiently managed, stored, and eventually discarded. The machine had succeeded. The experiment was complete. All that remained was to count the cost and decide whether the price was worth paying. But cost accounting doesn't include line items for souls destroyed, lives wasted, or hope systematically extinguished in the name of public safety. Those costs are hidden in statistics, buried in reports, classified as acceptable losses in the eternal war between order and chaos. The machine kept running because the alternative, admitting that the entire premise was flawed, was too expensive to contemplate. It was cheaper to repair the infrastructure than to rebuild the philosophy, easier to upgrade the technology than to acknowledge the humanity. And so the concrete walls stood firm while everything inside them slowly collapsed, one human being at a time, in silence so complete that the screaming couldn't be heard from the outside.